Imagine this, those classic horror flicks where the babysitter is left alone in an old, eerie house on Halloween night. That pretty much summed up my life in 2017, except I wasn't a calm and collected heroine. I was just a sarcastic, clueless 17-year-old high school junior with no survival instincts. I had somehow been roped into babysitting for the Hamiltons, a family with 3 kids under 10, at their remote farmhouse near Madison, Wisconsin. Sure, the extra cash was tempting, but spending Halloween out in the middle of nowhere? Not exactly my idea of a good time. The farmhouse itself could have been ripped straight from a horror movie: creaky wooden floors, dim lighting, no neighbors for miles, and a backyard that faded into endless rows of cornfields. Even the jack-o'-lanterns on the porch seemed to mock me as I stepped inside. The kids, Megan, 6, and the 8-year-old twins, Ryan and Max, were already buzzing with excitement and sugar, judging by the mountain of candy wrappers scattered around. "Can we watch something scary?" Ryan pleaded, his eyes lighting up. "No way," Megan protested, clutching a stuffed bunny. "How about a compromise?" I suggested, flipping through the Hamilton sparse DVD collection. We settled on Coraline, creepy enough to match the mood but not nightmare-inducing. About 20 minutes into the movie, the landline rang. The sound made me jump. Who even uses landlines anymore? Megan and the twins stared at me as I reluctantly got up to answer. Hanging on the wall was an old satellite phone, the kind farms use for emergencies. The caller ID was blank. "Hello?" I said, holding the phone to my ear. There was no response, just faint breathing. Classic prank call. "Very funny," I said dryly, then hung up and returned to the couch. I dismissed it as some teenager messing around, but 5 minutes later, the phone rang again. This time, a low, raspy voice whispered, "I'm watching you." I laughed nervously, though I didn't feel amused. "Nice try," I said, forcing a casual tone. "Happy Halloween to you, too." I slammed the phone down, my stomach twisting with unease. The kids noticed. "Who was that?" Megan asked. "Just a prank," I said, plastering on a smile that probably didn't fool anyone. We made it through most of the movie without incident, until the screen flickered and went black. At first, I thought it was just a glitch, but then I noticed the lights were out, too. "Is it a power outage?" Max asked, his voice trembling. "Probably," I said, trying to sound confident. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. "I'll check the breaker." Of course, the breaker box was in the basement. Because where else would it be? As I descended the creaky stairs, the air grew colder, and the weak beam of my flashlight barely pierced the shadows. When I reached the box, everything seemed fine, all the switches were in place. That's when I heard faint footsteps above me. My heart raced as I climbed back upstairs. The kids were huddled together on the couch, their faces pale in the glow of my flashlight. The landline rang again, slicing through the silence. "Don't answer it," Megan whispered, clutching a pillow. But I did. This time, the voice said, "You shouldn't have gone downstairs." My blood turned to ice. "Who is this?" I demanded, but the line went dead. I tried to calm the kids, forcing a cheerful tone as I said, "It's just someone trying to scare us." I didn't believe my own words. After double-checking that all the doors and windows were locked, I ushered the kids into the master bedroom. I propped a chair under the doorknob and tried to make it seem like a fun, camping adventure, but the tension was unbearable. Then I noticed the muddy footprints. They trailed from the back door, which I knew I had locked, through the kitchen and into the hallway. Someone had been inside. I grabbed my phone and whispered to 911, giving them all the details. The dispatcher assured me help was on the way, but we were far from town, it would take time. Meanwhile, I heard faint breathing outside the bedroom door, followed by the slow jiggling of the handle. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice shaking. The jiggling stopped. Then footsteps moved away, accompanied by the sound of drawers opening and closing in the adjacent room. The kids clung to me as we waited in terrified silence. A loud crash shattered the quiet, a vase or picture frame hitting the floor just outside. I stared at the chair bracing the door, silently praying it would hold. Finally, the sound of sirens pierced the night. Footsteps pounded down the hall, followed by the roar of a motorcycle engine. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows, and a firm knock came at the front door. The police had arrived. Shaking, I led the kids out of the room. The officers searched the house and surrounding property but found no one. They did find signs of forced entry, muddy footprints, open drawers, and scattered belongings. The Hamiltons rushed home, horrified by what had happened. They apologized profusely, but I couldn't stay another minute. As I drove home, the adrenaline wore off, leaving me exhausted and shaken. Halloween used to be my favorite holiday, a night for fun and harmless scares. But that night changed everything. Now, I take every sound, every strange call seriously. Because sometimes, the scariest monsters aren't in movies, they're the ones standing right outside your door. When I agreed to babysit for the Petersons at their countryside home near Nashville, Tennessee, I figured it would be a straightforward gig. They had a sweet toddler named Lily and Rufus, their massive German shepherd who looked intimidating but had a heart of gold. His tail wagged like clockwork, and his warm brown eyes seemed to promise he'd protect us from anything. Honestly, I was almost more excited to hang out with Rufus than babysit. The house was a cozy, rustic gem nestled among towering trees that looked like something out of a postcard. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of pine and damp leaves, and the rhythmic chirping of crickets created a serene soundtrack. Mrs. Peterson gave me a quick tour, pointing out the security system and Lily's bedtime routine. "Rufus will keep watch," she said with a smile, ruffling his thick fur. "He's the best guard dog you could ask for." I grinned, scratching behind his ears. I believe it. Once the Petersons left, the house settled into a quiet calm. Lily was a breeze, happy to play with her stuffed bunny and listen to bedtime stories. By 8:30, she was sound asleep, her gentle snores drifting through the baby monitor. I curled up on the couch with a cup of tea, Rufus sprawled at my feet. The crackling fireplace filled the living room with warmth, while the woods outside were a dense black void, far removed from the glow of city lights. As I sipped my tea, Rufus suddenly perked up. His ears stood tall, his body tensed, and a low growl rumbled from his throat. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, following his gaze to the sliding glass door that led to the backyard. The trees swayed gently in the wind, but I couldn't see anything unusual. "Probably just a raccoon," I muttered, mostly to reassure myself. But Rufus didn't relax. He stayed by the door, growling softly, his fur bristling. The first hour passed uneventfully, but Rufus remained on edge. Every so often, he'd let out a sharp bark, his eyes darting to the windows or toward the backyard. I tried to brush it off as him being overly cautious, but unease began to creep in. While rummaging in the kitchen for a snack, I noticed something that made my stomach drop, faint smudges on the sliding door's glass, near the bottom, as if someone had pressed their hands against it. Leaning closer, I spotted faint footprints in the dirt outside the door. They were too large to belong to a child. My throat tightened as I backed away. "It's fine," I whispered to myself. "Probably just someone passing through earlier." But Rufus's growl suggested otherwise. I locked the sliding door and went through the house, double-checking that all doors and windows were secure. By the time I returned to the couch, my nerves were shot, and my tea was cold. Then came a soft knock. It wasn't at the front door, it was at the living room window. My heart leapt into my throat. Rufus was already there, barking ferociously, his claws scraping the wooden floor as he lunged toward the glass. The porch light illuminated only a small patch near the front steps, leaving the rest of the yard shrouded in darkness. I couldn't see who, or what, had knocked. I grabbed my phone and tried calling Mrs. Peterson, but it went straight to voicemail. Next, I called the police. The operator assured me officers were on their way, but they were at least 20 minutes out. Great, I muttered, glancing at Rufus. Looks like it's just us, buddy. The knocking stopped, but the tension in the house was unbearable. Rufus stayed by the window, his growls a constant warning. I decided to check on Lily, climbing the stairs as quietly as I could. She was still sound asleep, clutching her bunny. But as I turned to leave, I caught a flicker of movement through her window. In the backyard, near the tree line, was a shadowy figure. They moved slowly, weaving between the trees, before stopping at the edge of the yard. They were tall, and something metallic glinted in their hand, a flashlight, a knife. I couldn't tell. My pulse thundered in my ears as I rushed back downstairs. Rufus was still at the window, barking louder than ever. I crouched beside him. "Okay, boy," I whispered. "What's the plan?" As if on cue, Rufus bolted toward the back door, barking with renewed fury. Through the glass, I saw the figure approaching the house. My hand shot out, grabbing the nearest object, a heavy wooden broom. The figure came closer, their hood obscuring their face. Rufus barked so violently that it startled them. They stumbled back, dropping their flashlight. Moments later, the sound of sirens sliced through the night. Blue and red lights flashed as a patrol car pulled into the driveway. The intruder bolted toward the woods, vanishing into the darkness. I opened the door for the officers, my hands trembling. Rufus stayed by my side, his protective stance unyielding. The police searched the property but found no sign of the intruder, only the flashlight they had dropped. When Mrs. Peterson returned home, I recounted everything. She hugged me tightly, her face pale with worry. "Rufus saved us," I said, scratching his ears. His tail wagged gently, his eyes calm now that the danger had passed. "I've always loved animals, but that night, Rufus wasn't just a pet, he was a hero." Locks and alarms are helpful, but nothing beats the loyalty and instincts of a devoted dog. I've always been great with kids, which is part of why I decided to pursue teaching. So when my mom's friend, Mrs. Kelly, asked if I could babysit her 5-year-old son, Charlie, one mild spring evening in 2018, I immediately agreed. It seemed like an easy way to spend an evening. Their house, tucked away in a charming town in upstate New York, felt like a warm embrace, a place where everything seemed peaceful and safe. I couldn't have guessed how unsettling the night would turn out. Charlie was an interesting little boy, quiet but not shy. He had a focused, almost otherworldly way about him, like he was lost in his own thoughts. When I arrived, he was seated on the living room floor, carefully arranging his toy cars in a straight line. Mrs. Kelly gave me a quick rundown. Bedtime was 8:30, snacks were in the fridge, and emergency contacts were posted on the fridge door. It all seemed straightforward. "Oh, by the way," Mrs. Kelly added with a chuckle, "Charlie's been talking about his friend a lot lately. Just his imagination, I'm sure." I nodded, thinking how typical it was for kids his age to invent imaginary companions. It sounded cute more than anything. After Mrs. Kelly left, I tried chatting with Charlie, but he wasn't very talkative. He answered my questions with short phrases or nods, his attention never leaving his toys. After a while, I gave up and settled on the couch with a book, letting the house's calmness wrap around me. The golden light of the setting sun streamed through the windows, and birds chirped faintly outside. Everything felt serene, until I heard Charlie whispering. At first, I thought he was humming to himself, but then I caught fragments of what he was saying. "Yes, Grandpa. I'll show her." Curious, I set my book down. "Who are you talking to, Charlie?" He looked up with the same serious expression he'd had all evening. "Grandpa." I smiled. "Is Grandpa your friend?" Charlie shook his head solemnly. "No. He's my real grandpa. He comes to visit." That made me pause. I knew enough about the Kelly family to know Charlie's grandparents had passed away years ago. Maybe he'd heard stories about his grandfather and turned him into an imaginary friend. "What's Grandpa like?" I asked, intrigued. "He stands by the tree in the backyard," Charlie said without hesitation. "He has a watch that goes tick-tick-tick, and he rocks in his chair." The detail in his response gave me chills. It wasn't the kind of vague story you'd expect from a child, it felt strangely vivid. I glanced toward the backyard, but all I saw was the old tree, its bare branches swaying gently in the evening breeze. As the night went on, I couldn't shake the unease his words had sparked. Charlie wasn't the type to spin elaborate tales, and the way he spoke about his grandpa was so matter-of-fact. After dinner, we played with blocks in the living room, but Charlie kept glancing toward the sliding glass doors that led to the backyard. "Do you want to play outside?" I asked, hoping to ease his nerves. Charlie shook his head quickly. "He doesn't like it when I go out there," he said softly. "Who doesn't?" I asked, though I already knew his answer. "Grandpa." I tried to brush it off, but his tone left me feeling uneasy. "Why doesn't he like it?" I pressed. "He says it's not safe." By the time I tucked Charlie into bed, my nerves were frayed. The house was so quiet that even the faintest sound seemed magnified. I sat in the living room, scrolling through my phone in an attempt to distract myself. Then I heard it, a soft creak, like someone stepping on old wood. My eyes darted to the sliding glass doors. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow by the tree, but when I blinked, it was gone. "It's just the wind," I told myself, though my pulse quickened. Still, I locked the door, just to be safe. Later, while tidying up, my attention was drawn to a photo on the mantel. It was an old black and white picture of a man sitting in a rocking chair under a tree. His face was kind but weathered, and on his wrist was a watch with a distinctive round face. My breath caught. Charlie's description had been spot on, down to the smallest detail. I set the photo back, my hands trembling. How could Charlie know about this? Had he seen the picture before? Or had someone told him stories about his grandfather? Even so, it didn't explain how vividly he'd described him. That night, as I lay on the couch, I heard a faint voice. "Grandpa, why are you sad?" It was coming from Charlie's room. My heart raced as I tiptoed down the hall, pausing outside his door. "I miss you too," Charlie said softly. "But she doesn't believe me." I pushed the door open. Charlie was sitting up in bed, startled. "Who are you talking to?" I asked. "Grandpa," he whispered, pointing to the window. He was standing right there. The next morning, when Mrs. Kelly returned, I hesitated but finally asked, "Can I ask you something about Charlie?" "Of course," she said, unloading groceries. I told her everything, Charlie's descriptions, his conversations, and the picture on the mantel. Mrs. Kelly froze, her face pale. "My father passed away a few weeks ago," she said quietly. "Charlie doesn't know. We didn't want to upset him." A chill ran through me. But he described him perfectly, the watch, the chair. Mrs. Kelly nodded, her voice trembling. "Those were my dad's favorite things. He spent hours under that tree, rocking and tinkering with that watch." I didn't know what to say. Was Charlie really seeing his grandfather's spirit? Or was this his way of processing grief he didn't fully understand? Even now, I wonder about that night. Was Charlie just an imaginative child, or was there something more to his words? Whatever the truth, it reminded me that some mysteries are beyond explanation, and maybe they're not meant to be solved. I took the babysitting job because, as a broke freshman in college studying journalism, I needed the extra money. The task was straightforward: watch 6-year-old Mia for a few hours while her mom, a nurse, worked the late shift at the hospital. The apartment was located in an older section of New Orleans, a neighborhood where the humid air seemed to cling to your skin and the streets exuded a kind of worn charm. It was a sticky summer evening in 2016, the sun having just dipped below the horizon, leaving the sidewalks bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. The apartment itself was cozy, small but clean and inviting. Mia's mom, Mrs. Ellis, gave me the usual instructions: emergency contacts, acceptable snacks, and Mia's bedtime. Mia was shy at first, but it didn't take long for her to warm up to me, and soon we were giggling over her collection of picture books. Mia had just fallen asleep when I noticed him for the first time. The living room had a large window that overlooked the street, framed by thin, floral-patterned curtains. From my spot on the couch, I could see the usual scene outside: parked cars, streetlights, and the occasional person walking by. At first, the man didn't seem out of the ordinary, just someone standing near a lamppost across the street, dressed in a gray hoodie. But then I realized he wasn't moving. His face was hidden in the shadow of his hood, but I could feel his gaze fixed on the apartment, on the very window where I sat. I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was waiting for someone or just taking a break. Still, the way he stood there, unnervingly still, sent a chill through me. I pulled the curtains shut and tried to focus on my book, though I couldn't fully shake the unease settling in my chest. An hour passed. The man was still there. I peeked through the curtain, hoping he'd left, but no, he remained, leaning casually against the lamppost, hood pulled low. The street was quiet now, and his presence felt increasingly out of place. I considered calling Mrs. Ellis but stopped myself, not wanting to overreact. Instead, I mentally noted to check the locks and glanced toward Mia's room to ensure she was still peacefully asleep. As I moved through the apartment, an eerie sense of being watched crept over me, even with the curtains closed. By 10 p.m., I thought he was finally gone, until I heard it. A knock. But it wasn't at the door. It came from the living room window. My entire body froze. Slowly, I walked toward the sound, each step feeling heavier than the last. The knocking came again, deliberate and sharp. I hesitated, then pulled the curtain back just enough to see. My breath hitched. He was standing there, only inches from the glass, the shadow of his hood obscuring his face. But I could see the faint outline of his jaw and the gleam of his eyes in the dim light. I let the curtain fall back and stumbled away, my heart pounding so hard I could barely hear my own thoughts. Grabbing my phone with trembling hands, I dialed 911. "There's a man outside," I whispered, trying not to let my voice carry. "He's been watching for hours, and now he's knocking on the window." The operator reassured me that officers were on the way and told me to stay inside and lock the doors. I double-checked the locks, my ears straining for any sound. I heard it then, the faint jiggling of the doorknob. My stomach twisted as I stared at the door, willing myself to believe it was just my imagination. But the knob rattled again, this time more insistently. He was testing the lock. Grabbing the heaviest object I could find, a decorative vase, I positioned myself between the door and Mia's room. My hands shook as I held the vase, my eyes never leaving the door. The jiggling stopped. Silence fell. For a fleeting moment, I dared to hope he'd left. But then I heard footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, moving toward the side of the building. He was circling the apartment. My breath came in shallow bursts as I listened to every step. The thin curtains suddenly felt like no barrier at all. Then the footsteps stopped, replaced by a sharp tap on the window. My eyes darted toward the sound. A shadow shifted behind the curtain, just barely visible in the glow of the streetlights. He was there, waiting, as if savoring my fear. I stayed frozen, afraid to even call out. I didn't want to wake Mia and alert the man to her presence. She was so close, peacefully asleep in her little bed, unaware of the danger just outside. I had to keep her safe. Finally, in the distance, I heard sirens. The faint wail grew louder, and I saw flashing blue and red lights illuminate the street. The shadow shifted, then disappeared. Moments later, a knock at the door made me jump. I checked the peephole and exhaled in relief when I saw 2 police officers. "He's gone," I whispered after unlocking the door. My voice trembled as I explained everything: the hours he'd watched, the knocking, the attempts to get in. The officers inspected the apartment while I waited anxiously, clutching the vase like a lifeline. Outside, they found footprints by the window and faint scratches on the door. "We'll patrol the area," one of them assured me. But his words didn't offer much comfort. The man was gone, taking any answers with him. When Mrs. Ellis returned, I recounted everything. She hugged Mia tightly, apologizing over and over, though it wasn't her fault. She promised to install security cameras immediately. I told her I couldn't babysit again. Just being in that apartment after what had happened felt impossible. Years later, the memory of that night still lingers. I've become hyper-aware of windows and locks, scanning the street for anyone who might linger too long. The scariest part? The real monsters aren't hiding under your bed. They're out there, standing in the shadows, waiting for you to notice them. And once you do, you'll never forget.